What's up, guys? It's Hunter Sitchy from CheckShovPoker.com, and the title of today's video is 1025 at the Isle. So I think the title is pretty self-explanatory. I played a pretty fun session of 10 and a quarter at the Isle the other day, and I feel like I got myself into four situations that were worth discussing with you guys. So without further explanation, let's just jump into some of these hand histories. So in this first hand, it folds to the hijack, who is a very, very good MTT player that also plays large cash games. The cutoff and the button get out of the way, the small blind calls, and I'm in the big blind with Queen Jack suited. So if this had been a heads up pot, I think Queen Jack suited would be toward the bottom of my defense range against a standard hijack open. Since this particular hijack is opening a little bit wider than normal, I certainly would have defended with it. And now in this situation where the small blind call is giving me significantly better odds, I'm definitely calling here. And I think three betting would be a mistake in this spot because stacks are relatively deep and it exposes us to a four bet from a very aggressive player in the hijack. So overall, I think calling is just way better. Queen Jack suited plays well out of position because it has the suited connectedness as well as high card value. So flop comes 8 of diamonds, 7 of diamonds, 5 of spades, small blind checks, I check to the aggressor, and the hijack bets 300. So at the time, I felt like this was a misclick, but now that I think about it, I actually think that he was trying to just go for a bigger value with either an overpair or two pair plus in this spot, and I also think he would probably mix in some bigger diamond draws or maybe a hand like 6-5. So that kind of skews his range a little bit in this situation, not so much so that I'm going to alter my play from what I would do as a default. So small blind folds and I check call. I think check calling is better than check raising in this spot because I have better diamond draws to check raise with. And I also think that Queen Jack just plays a little bit better as a check call stab river line or check call and pair up check call again line. So that's kind of what I was thinking moving forward in this hand. The turn is the 8 of spades, I check, and the hijack bets 400. So there's a pretty big difference between his flop sizing in comparison to the size of the pot and his turn sizing in comparison to the size of the pot. What I felt like this meant was he was trying to get extra value with an overpair in a spot where it was starting to become increasingly thin. I have a lot more eights in my range and a lot more full houses in my range than the hijack does. And because of that, I think that opens this up for a check shove from me, especially once you consider the fact that my stack size is almost perfect for this. I'm risking 2,500 to win 1225, leaving a 2-to-1 ratio here. So if we stop the hand right now and I had no outs to improve, I would only need my opponent to fold about 2/3 of the time to make this play break even. And I think he has so many overpairs in his range that he's probably going to be forced to fold since I have so many full houses and eights in my range that I think that just makes this an excellent play. So now I'd like to go over to Flopzilla and break this down a little bit further in terms of the part of his range that I was targeting with this play. So if I take you over to Flopzilla, I can break down the situation for you fairly quickly. So the first thing we need to do is go over and enter our hand into the dead cards. So Queen Jack of diamonds, that removes these cards from the deck. And it also allows us to calculate our pot equity versus our opponent's perceived range that we're going to create here shortly. Then we go over to the board and enter the flop, 8-7 of diamonds, 5 of spades, turn card, 8 of spades. Then we go over to this range box and create a worst case scenario. So let's enter all of the best hands in our opponent's bet range in this situation. I think it's quad eights, sevens full, fives full, and 8-7 suited. Okay. Then if you go over to statistics, you see that there are a total of 9 combinations of those hands. They're highlighted in purple on the left. If you want to switch it over to percentage, you just press the tab button, and I'll show you how to do that here shortly. Now we go back over here and develop the rest of our opponent's perceived range. I think he would include 9s through aces in that range, as well as a variety of flush draws and backdoor flush draw hands. So I think we could add ace deuce through ace king suited, all of these Broadway hands, and a variety of suited connectors and suited gappers. He's an exceptionally aggressive opponent, so I think it's fair to say that he's opening 6-4 suited from the hijack. Then the last thing we need to do is filter out some of the suited combinations that he could be betting. So he's not going to be betting like ace king of hearts on this board. He's only going to be betting diamonds and spades. So to filter out those combinations, you need to go over here and click spades and diamonds, and then apply a filter to these combinations right here, and then hands like maybe these. The rest of these suited connectors can stay because they have pairs and open-enders, and he's probably betting with those, or maybe they have gut shots and overcards. Okay, then the last thing we need to do is just go over and evaluate our the equity of our hand. So we have 30% equity against this range. So if he never folds, we have 30% equity. That's quite a bit. If he's folding a lot, it goes down to almost zero because he's really just only calling us with full houses. So this number fluctuates back and forth, and it makes fold equity calculations pretty difficult unless you go into Flopzilla and really break it down. Okay, so then we can go over to statistics and count up the total number of combinations of hands in his range and figure out how many we think he's folding. So this pre-flop range includes 108 combinations that we think he would take a bet line with. Then we just go in here and calculate quads, full house, straight, and three of a kind that we don't think he's ever folding. We filter that down here by pressing this button and activating the filter feature, and we see that that adds up to a total number of 19 combinations, or we can switch this tab and it switches over to 17.6% of his total range here. So all in all, I don't think he's continuing that often because I think he's going to fold over pairs. Our range has way more eights and way more full houses than his range does. And I don't think he can call it off with flush draws because he's only getting 2-1 after I shove, and there's a possibility that he could be drawing dead against our perceived range. So all in all, I really only think he's calling like 17.6% of the time, and we only need him to fold 66% of the time to make a profit. He's actually folding over 80% of the time in this situation. Now, then worst case scenario, let's say that he is calling with over pairs here. We go back here, filter it again, and he's calling with 45% of his range. We only need him to fold 66% of the time. He's actually folding 55% of the time in this situation. And if we enter it into a fold equity calculator, you realize that we still have 20% equity against that range because we can improve to a flush. So now I'm going to take you over to pokerbluffTools.com and show you how to break down the rest of this situation. So if you're unfamiliar with simple fold equity calculations, I would strongly suggest going over to pokerbluffTools.com/calculators and playing around with their pure bluff calculator to start to get a feel for how often you need your opponent to fold to make an outright profit when you have no chance of improving. So in this situation, the pot size pre-bluff was 1225. The main pot was 825, and our opponent's bet was 400. And then the bluff amount was 2500. And leaving a variable open for calculation, we hit the calculate button and discovered that we need our opponent to fold 67.11% of the time on the turn if we have no chance of improving. Okay. Since we do have a chance of improving, we can go over to the semi-bluff calculator and add two more variables. And the pot size pre-bluff remains the same, it's 1225. Our shove remains the same, it's 2500. The expected value should always be 0. This is a feature that is designed to give you a little bit of extra value if you think that you have some sort of skill edge on a later part of the hand and you're not all in. Okay, so under normal circumstances, you just leave this as 0. And then equity when called is the most difficult thing to figure out because you really have to go into Flopzilla like we just did and break down your opponent's range significantly, especially on dynamic boards. So Like I said, it could be a maximum of 30%. It could be a minimum of 0% because our opponent might only be calling with full houses. I think a fair compromise is about 15%, and that kind of gives us a good ballpark figure to operate off of. Again, leaving a variable open for calculation, we hit the calculate button and discover that now we only need our opponent to fold 56 0.11% of the time. And after that last calculation that we did in Flopzilla, we discovered that our opponent was folding about 55 or 56% of the time. We see that this play is break even if our opponent is calling us with two pair combinations like nines and eights. So we don't need to get him to fold that much since we have a bunch of equity and there's already a lot of money in the pot. So at worst, this play is break even for us, and at best, it's extremely, extremely profitable. So to recap, my opponent ended up folding, and I think I picked up a pot that most people wouldn't pick up just because I'm slightly more aware of pot equity, fold equity, and range versus range analysis. So here's another interesting hand that happened at the aisle. It ends up folding around to the cutoff, who is a very good MTT player that also plays big cash games. And one of the things I know about him is I think he defends against 3-bets a little bit too often. So because of that, I think Ace King is pretty much a mandatory 3-bet for value in this spot. Small blind, big blind fold, and cutoff ends up making the call. We go heads up to a flop of Ace 8-7 with two hearts, cutoff checks. And this is essentially the top of my range, so I think it's crucial to be betting it both for profitability and balance purposes. I bet 300, that's totally standard when stacks are this deep, and cutoff ends up check calling. The turn is the 8 of clubs, cutoff checks, and I bet 800. I go a little bit bigger because I also have plenty of semi-bluffs in my range that I need to balance for, and I think I would also take a line similar to this. So because of that, I bet 800. And here's where the interesting situation comes up. Cutoff check raises to 2,800, essentially committing his stack, and I don't think that I can really call turn and fold any river if I decide to just play it like that. So because of that, I have to make a decision and decide if I want to continue against his range here. And I think the biggest thing to understand is that this opponent is thinking on a much higher level than most people. So this is certainly not a 2-5 no limit hand history review. This is a guy that is actively trying to get people to fold top pair in this spot. And because of that, I think the range analysis needs to be a bit different. So I'm going to take you over to Flopzilla again and see if I can figure out what the best play is here. All right, so if I take you over to Flopzilla and do the exact same thing as last hand, I think a couple interesting things come up. So let's enter our cards: Ace of Clubs, King of Spades. Let's enter the board: Ace of Hearts, 8 of Hearts, 7 of Clubs, turn card, 8 of Clubs. And then we can go over here and start speculating as to what our opponent's range is. And I think it's always best to start pre-flop. So what do I think he's opening with from the cutoff? I think it's fair to say that this guy is a very good aggressive player. He's opening with all of his broadways, all of his pocket pairs. I think all of his suited connectors and suited gappers, especially since we're this deep. And most of his suited aces, I think King 8, Queen 8, Jack 8 suited are pretty fair, as well as these offsuit 9 combinations. So that's roughly 30%. I think it could fluctuate back and forth 5% either way, but this is a pretty good ballpark figure to operate off of. Then you just take it to the next action in the hand. I 3-bet, so what do I think he's defending a 3-bet with? Well, I think the best thing to do is to speculate as to what his 4-betting range is, and then eliminate that from his calling range. So I think he's most likely 4-betting with aces, kings, and ace king almost always. I think I've seen him use a polarized 4-betting range. So he's probably going to throw ace deuce through ace 5 suited in there, and because of that, we can eliminate that from his calling range. I think eliminating these offsuit 9 combinations is important, and I think hands like some of these ace 6, ace 7, ace 8, and king 8 through 10 8 suited combinations. Maybe, king 8 through jack 8 suited combinations should be eliminated just because they're not very playable out of position, and he probably realizes that. So the other thing to consider is that we are really deep. We're over 200 big blinds deep, and because of that, I think he's probably defending a bit wider, so he's going to keep those small pocket pairs, suited connectors, suited gappers in there for the most part. So then moving on to my flop bet, what do I think he's check calling with? I think he's check calling with all of his aces. He's probably going to check fold all of these offsuit Broadway combos. I think he's probably going to check fold deuces through sixes. Check call with all these middle pairs and all of the eights and sevens in his range. The one thing that we do need to filter for is hearts and clubs. I think he's good enough to realize that he needs to be check calling with backdoor club draws, especially if they have a gut shot or a piece of the board. And I think he's also check calling with at least some of his heart combinations. I don't think he's check raising with all of them. So we go over here and we just filter for that. So we go in here and just add that to all of these middling combinations. I don't think 10-9 or 10-8 need to be filtered. 10-9 is an open-ender, and he's not folding any of those suits. 10-8, 9-8, 8-7, and 8-6 all have a pair on the flop, and I think he's check calling with all of those. 9-7, 7-6, 7-5, same thing. 6-5 suited as an open-ender, and I think 6-4 and 5-4 suited probably should be filtered because they're just gut shots unless they're suited. Okay? So then moving on to the turn, he checks, I bet 800, and he check raises. How does that narrow his range down? Well, first of all, this guy is a logical player, and I don't think he's going to take hands like a pair of aces and turn it into a bluff. I think for the most part he's going to play those as showdown value. I don't think he's going to take hands like queens through nines and check raise with them because they also have showdown value, and there are hands with more equity that he could decide to check raise with. Then after that, it's kind of fair game here. He could be check raising with any of this, and I think a lot of people would try and argue that he could be check raising with some of this on the flop. But if he is, I think he's also check raising with 8s, 7s, and 8-7 suited non-zero percentage of the time, and because of that, I think it kind of negates the calculation. So we can just take all of these and put them in one street for our calculation. So now we can just quickly glance over here and figure out how much equity our hand has against this range if he decides to check raise with all of this. And right now we're doing pretty well. We have 63% equity against this range. And if we scale back some of his aggression a bit, let's say that we eliminate some of these flush draws here. We're still doing okay. Eliminate a few more. Now let's go, we're still over 50%, so we should always be getting it in. Then let's go back here and filter again and get a little bit more aggressive with the filtering and filter 10-9 so it only has hearts and clubs in it. 9-7 so it only has hearts and clubs in it. 7-6, 7-5, and 6-5 so it only has hearts and clubs in it. So now we've narrowed it down to 23 combos of hands that he could get to the turn with and check raise and take this line with. Okay, so this is an extremely narrow range of check raises, and you still see that we have 37% equity. And if you rewind the video and look at the bet sizing, I essentially have to risk $4,000 to win $7,000, and if you throw that into a calculator, you'll discover that I need to win just under 40% of the time, or have just under 40% equity to break even. So this is like the break even threshold right here. If I think his range is this wide or wider, I should continue, and I certainly think it is. I think this is like worst case scenario, and I think he's likely to have a lot of the other suited flush draw hands that I was talking about. The one other thing to consider is that I have the ace of clubs in my hand, and um, it does block suited um, ace X of club combinations from his range, so he couldn't take those and decide to turn them into a bluff and see if he could get me off a stronger ace. But at the same time, it also reduces the number of outs that his other club draw combinations have, the non-ace club draw combinations. So he'd go from having 9 outs to 8, and I think that probably skews it in my favor just a little bit. I'm interested to see what you guys think about all of that. But overall, this is another situation where I think worst case scenario, I'm breaking even, and best case scenario, I'm making quite a bit of money. And so now I'll go back to the hand history and show you what actually happened. So what actually ended up happening was I stuff and commit for the reasons that we just listed, and my opponent snap calls with quads. So if we're not being results oriented, I think that this is a great play on my part. If we are being results oriented, I think this is a really bad play on my part. But this also brings up another really good point. I don't think I tilt very often, and I think the reason is that I have several layers of thought and logic going into my decision making, and I realize that this is a long-term play. There are a lot of plays like this where you have kind of a way ahead, way behind situation. Ace King creates a lot of spots like that. And then there are a lot of spots where when you're against a really good player, you can't really fold the top of your range, even though there are situations where, like this, where you could be drawing dead. I think long term that would be a huge detriment to your game. If anyone ever knew that you were folding the top of your range to a check raise here, that would be extremely exploitable, especially when you're playing against a guy as good as the cutoff was in this hand. So overall, I'm happy with my decision making, even though I lost the pot. Alright, so I'm glad we're done with those last two hands. I was actually hesitant to put them in this video because the level of analysis necessary to get an accurate picture of those situations is extremely daunting. And as you can see, it took me 15 minutes for each of those hands just in Flopzilla plus Poker Bluff tools. And then if I wanted to be more accurate, I'd have to take it over to Card Runner's EV, and it's a lot of work. So that's why I strongly suggest writing those hands down and working on them off the table so you can start to build up an intuitive understanding of those difficult spots like that, because solving it in real time is almost impossible. This hand is actually a much simpler. I just wanted to bring up something about pre-flop bet sizing. So this is the same guy as last hand. He opens to 75. I 3-bet to 225. My 3-bet sizing is the same regardless of what I'm 3-betting with. I think that's very important, especially against astute players like this guy. And then he ends up 4-betting really big. He goes up to 825. And essentially what he's trying to do is create a shove or fold situation for me, because I can no longer take a hand like, let's say I 3-bet with 7-6 suited. I can no longer flat here because the SPR won't be deep enough going into the flop that I have incentive to continue with a hand like that. So flatting here looks really, really, really strong, and I think shoving with aces is far better than flatting with them almost always. So that's what I decide to do, and he snap calls with ace king, and I double up. But there are a couple of things to bring up here. First of all, when he's snap calling a 5-bet with ace king, he's essentially saying that he recognizes my shoving range to be very polarized, and I think that he is assuming that I'm including ace deuce through ace 5 suited in my shoving range at least a non-zero percentage of the time, because if I wasn't, ace king is either flipping or crippled in this spot. When I do include those offsuit aces, ace king has much more incentive to continue because now it has some dominating possibilities in the range of hands that I'm shipping it with. The other thing to consider is that had he four bet smaller than this hand would have played out completely differently. So like if he had gone up to 475, which would be like a more normal four betting size, I think flatting with the entirety of my three betting range is probably way better than even having a five betting range. And it just allows me to protect hands like 7-6 suited or ace deuce suited with hands like aces kings and ace king. So there are certain situations like that where it doesn't make a lot of sense to even have a five betting range, and it's just due to stack sizes. So definitely be cognizant of that, and be cognizant of the 1/6 stack rule like I've talked about in other situations, and that's kind of how you determine whether you should have a five betting range in this spot or not. So here's the fourth and final hand, and I think at face value this looks like a huge cooler spot, but I think if you look a little bit closer you can learn a lot about deep stack play, especially in limped pots. So it ends up limping around to me in the big blind, and I have 7-6 off, and I knock it back. We go five ways to a flop of Jack 4-3 with two hearts, small blind checks, I check. And it ends up checking around. Nobody really had enough equity to lead out in this spot. The turn is the five of clubs, small blind checks again, and I bet 125 with the nuts, and I bet bigger because I think all the hands that people are going to continue with are calling any amount up to the full pot, and it's important to charge them the max when I have the nuts. Hijack ends up raising to 500, button folds, small blind calls, and for the same reason, all the hands that they're going to continue with on the turn have decent equity against me. It's important to either seal that equity out or get stacks in when I have an equity edge. I go up to 1500. Hijack goes up to 2800. Small blind calls. This looks like a very strange call because at this point, everybody at the table should be pretty much 100% sure that hijack has 7-6. And because of that, when I have 7-6, it makes it really hard for small blind to have anything that he can continue with. There are two sevens and two sixes left in the deck, and he has to have one of those combinations, or he can have a hand like six deuce of hearts, ace deuce of hearts, or maybe let's say like 5-6 of hearts, perhaps. But other than that, he really should not be continuing in this spot, and so much so that I don't even think he has a set in this spot. And I have 7-6. The other thing to note is that had we been like 20k deep, I would have just flatted here and prayed for a non-heart, non-board pair of river, because I think getting it in against 7-6 of hearts when I'm getting completely free rolled would be a huge, huge error when you're like 800 big blinds deep. The other thing to note is that if you have the 7 of hearts or the 6 of hearts in your hand, you can feel comfortable getting stacks in for any amount, of course, because you can't be getting free rolled. So anyway, even if somebody had shown me 7-6 of hearts on this turn, I still would have gotten it in because I'm getting significant odds now that there's so much money in the pot. So I end up shipping hijack calls, small blind calls, and the river is the 4 of spades. This shouldn't be a huge concern because neither of them should really have a set or two pair in this spot. And we end up tabling our hands, and hijack has 7-6 as suspected, and small blind has ace deuce of hearts, and we end up chopping up his money. But the thing that I wanted you to be aware of is, first of all, if we rewind here, knowing what the small blind has and evaluate his play, and go back to the flop, I think leading out is probably the best play for him because he buys up my small equity that could ended up turning into a huge loss for him. He buys up the hijack's equity, and he just takes down $125 pot uncontested. Now let's say he goes for the check raise and he misses on the flop. He turns the wheel. I think if he leads out, I end up raising. Hijack ends up 3-betting, and he can safely get away from ace deuce in this spot. I think when you check and try and go for the check raise in this spot, especially in a 5-handed limp pot like this, you're kind of just setting yourself up for a disaster because you don't have enough information to get away from your hand at this point. So that's why I've always encouraged my students to lead out when they flop something big and when they flop a big draw. And it's not just for value and balancing purposes, it's also for informational purposes. It allows you to make bigger folds in situations like this. And then the last thing to consider is that I knew that the small blind had half of the action of the hijack in this spot, and I think that that's another reason why the small blind decided to call in a spot where I might have actually folded ace deuce. It's because when he's getting half of the action of whatever the hijack earns in this spot, he has less at risk, and he has an opportunity to scoop both of us when he has an unfair advantage. It's That's what another thing you need to be aware of when you're playing really big games is like if people are selling action to each other and you know that sometimes weird spots like this can come up and it can sometimes alter situations like it did in this hand where small blind shouldn't necessarily have ace deuce of hearts ever. So that wraps up the video for me. I hope you guys got to learn a little bit more about Flopzilla and deep stack situations and big games, and hopefully you learn that you need to do a little bit more work off the table, especially in difficult spots like this that are hard to solve in real time. That's so important to your improvement, and I just strongly encourage you to do that. So anyway, I'm Hunter Sitchy from CheckShowPoker.com. Make sure you run good, have fun, and constantly look for ways to improve.